By now, I'm pretty sure you've heard all the pro-station wagon propaganda before. Station wagons or estates or whatever you want to call them are more practical than the sedan counterpart that they're based on without giving up too much in terms of driving dynamics, and they're just about as practical as the average crossover in their category while retaining the driving dynamics of the average sedan. Well, all of that is certainly true. The sales numbers indicate that Americans generally just don't care. But I still think that there's room on the market for this wagon right here, and I think one of my favorite wagons, period, in the United States, the Volvo V90 wagon. For 2021, Volvo has refreshed the V90, the V90 Cross Country, the V60, and the V60 Cross Country, giving Volvo theoretically 4 wagon models in the United States, which is more than any other manufacturer out there shifts. And interesting point of trivia, the Subaru Outback is the only station wagon in North America that outsells its sedan counterpart. The V90 certainly does not outsell the S90, but I think there are also some reasons for that, because one would normally think that the V90 would be more practical than the S90, but in some ways that's not the case. For 2021, we don't just get some refreshed Swedish wagons in America, we're also going to be getting the Mercedes-Benz E-Class wagon, but only in the all-terrain format, which is a more direct corollary to the V90 Cross Country, not the regular V90 that I'm looking at today. We also get the Audi A6 Allroad, which again is not a corollary to this model. So at the moment, the V90 really looks like it's going to be standing alone for 2021. Although this V90 certainly looks aggressive with its blacked out grille up front and the aggressive LED headlights, especially in this black paint, remember that the V90 wagon tops out at 316 horsepower in the United States, so there's no corollary to some of the more powerful German options that you do find out there. Now that said, remember that we're not getting as many of those German options in the United States for 2021. The changes for 2021 are pretty subtle. You might not have noticed it, but the front end is a little bit different than it was last year. You might also not notice that the V90 is notably shorter than the S90 sedan. That's because the S90 was designed as a short wheelbase or a long wheelbase sedan, and in the United States, oddly enough, we got both. When it first launched, we got the short version, which was almost the same length as this V90 wagon, and then the next year and onwards, we got the stretched version of the S90, which stretched it out to 200.1 inches long, almost in the full-size luxury category. The big difference between the S90 and V90 in the United States is that we have a lot less rear seat legroom in the V90, which I think is a pity. So depending on how you want to look at it, the S90 could actually be a bit more practical than the V90. If you're looking at passenger room, the S90 is going to be superior. We get significantly more legroom in the back, about 4 inches overall. But the cargo area obviously is the big reason you'd want to buy the V90. This has a very crossover-like cargo area. And that results in double the cargo capacity versus the S90, and a cargo capacity figure that is very similar to the Volvo XC60. Moving to the rear, we still have Volvo's very distinctive tail lamp design, very similar to what we find in the XC90 and XC60, but also a little bit of S90 tossed in there. The big difference for 2021 is that we no longer have visible exhaust tips at the bottom of the bumper. Volvo has decided to tuck them under the bumper to give this a cleaner look and make it look more similar to their upcoming electrified models. Although speaking of electrification, it's worth noting that the V90 and the V90 Cross Country are not available with Volvo's plug-in hybrid system that's available on nearly every other model in their lineup. Volvo has been absolutely obsessed with safety ever since the brand first launched, so it's no surprise that for 2021 we're getting a ton of active safety assistance and driver assistance technologies standard on every Volvo model. This is a little bit of a twist versus when the V90 and the rest of the modern Volvo lineup first launched, because back then Volvo was offering things like their city safety system standard, but not their entire suite of driver assistance technologies, and for 2021 we're getting more of those standard on the V90. You should know, however, that unlike some of the Asian competitors, there are still a few driver assistance features that are optional. As with every new Volvo sold in North America, except for the upcoming XC40 Recharge, all V90 models are going to have a 2-liter 4-cylinder engine under the hood. It comes in 2 flavors, T5 and T6. The base T5 engine employs a turbocharger to give us 250 horsepower out of the 2-liter 4-cylinder engine, and the T6 option bumps things up to 316 by adding a supercharger but not removing the turbocharger. The supercharger gives the T6 variant of this engine excellent low-end torque, and the turbocharger takes over at higher speeds to improve efficiency. Both engines are mated to a standard Aisin automatic transmission. The T5 engine is front-wheel drive only. The T6, which is what we're looking at today, is all-wheel drive only. So if you want all-wheel drive, you get 316 horsepower. If you want front-wheel drive, you get 250. As you'd expect out of a modern Volvo, front seat comfort is excellent. This is a multi-way adjustable power driver seat. We have adjustable thigh cushion extensions and a 4-way adjustable lumbar support. Today I'm driving the R-Design trim, so there are a few slight differences if you get the inscription trim. We have a 2-position memory over there on the driver's door, and Volvo continues to give us a manual tilt telescopic steering column, which is starting to be a little unusual in the luxury segment. Most of the competition gives us a power adjustable steering column that's memory linked to the buttons over there on the door. However, one of the reasons that possibly we get a manual variety in the Volvo is it does seem to have a slightly larger range of motion than some of those powered designs. You'll certainly notice the difference between the S90 and V90 if you hop in these back-to-back when you're at the dealer. Although the V90 certainly has a reasonable amount of room, certainly more than the last Volvo wagon that I owned. Full disclosure, I did have a V70R back in 2006-ish. You'll notice I have about 5 to 4 inches of legroom sitting here behind myself with the front seat adjusted for me at 6 feet tall. But if I move over to the right side where this front seat's all the way back in its tracks, that drops down to about an inch. Very similar to the other mid-size options in the luxury segment. But the S90, on the other hand, has about 4 inches more combined legroom because all of the stretch in the S90 happened right here in the rear seat area. The S90 was stretched because the Chinese market loves long wheelbase vehicles, and then Volvo decided that America and other world markets deserved the long wheelbase version as well. So we only got the short wheelbase S90, strangely enough, for just 1 year. Its very first launch year. The next year they gave us the stretched version only. And that does mean that rear seat accommodations are certainly going to be a bit more comfortable in that S90. But headroom is really good in the V90 because of the more crossover-like profile, this wagon-like shape. So even with this panoramic moonroof, I still have about an inch of headroom left. If you're debating between the S90 and the V90, you have to decide whether legroom or headroom is more important to you. Also, whether features like these integrated child booster seats are a bit more important to you as well. The integrated child booster seats are designed to give the child the right height to integrate properly with the shoulder belt here, and they come in a 2-stage fashion. You can actually bump them up a little bit for some of those smaller children. They're designed for kids between 33 and 80 pounds, so basically when they would leave the forward-facing child seats, theoretically you could use these integrated booster seats rather than one of those aftermarket booster seats. It does give the vehicle a cleaner look, and it's really handy if you don't have kids in your vehicle too often. So if you're a grandparent or perhaps you're the carpool person and occasionally you might need an additional booster seat in addition to the one that you have over here on this side, this could be a really handy feature. One thing I've always found odd about Volvo's vehicle lineup is that the V90 offers 2 integrated booster seats, one on each side of the rear seats, but the XC90 offers only one right here in the center position. As you'd expect out of a luxury wagon with a near $70,000 price point, we have a lot of stitched materials going on the rear doors, the same level of attention to details we had on the front, and some well-integrated manual window shades. We also have 4-zone automatic climate control, and it can be locked out by the front climate control zones. Now it's time to talk about the whole reason to buy the wagon in the first place. It's all about the hatch. Now over time, Volvo's hatches have become a little bit more raked than they were in the past, and rather unfortunately that has reduced cargo practicality. Although we still find about double the cargo space that you'd get in an S90 back here at 33.9 cubic feet. When looking at the cubic foot capacity listings for Volvo's product line, it's important to remember that the Swedes go about measuring cargo area a little bit differently than some of the competition. So depending on the number you're looking at, this area could be listed as around 18 or 19 cubic feet, and sometimes it's listed as 33.9. The 33.9 number is going all the way to the ceiling, which is the same measurement style that, for instance, Toyota and Honda use in the RAV4 and CR-V. So when you're looking at this and comparing it with most of the options out there, you should be looking at the larger number. There's also another number listed, and that's about 65 cubic feet. That is the cargo space behind the first row seat. So if you had the second row seats down and you were using the entire cargo area, you'd get about 65 to 66 cubic feet of storage space. Although this look is certainly sexy, you'll notice the loss of practicality versus some of those classic Volvos of yore with this raked design, because you could have an awful lot more storage space in here if this was that boxier classic Volvo proportion. But we still have a large cargo area with a lot of practical touches like these metal tie-down points that lift up from the load floor, some additional storage space under the load floor, and a temporary spare tire. Not too many mid-size luxury sedans have a spare anymore. And one feature that I wasn't quite expecting was this motorized tonneau cover. If you're the kind of person who doesn't always close their roller cover because sometimes it's a bit of a pain, this one will automatically lift into this upper position, which is admittedly not quite as rolled in as rolling it completely in right like that. But it will also, if I can get it back into place, motorize into a completely closed position when we close the hatch. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that we are in the R-Design trim. We have a large panoramic moonroof right here over the driver and front passengers' heads. It goes all the way back there to the second row, but you'll notice that the cover does not completely block out the sun. The panoramic roof is so large that it extends to about 18 inches beyond the rear door openings. Moving back to the front, we have height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger and fixed height headrests. The seat design should be pretty familiar if you've driven any recent Volvo model. These are essentially the same seats that we find in the 60 and 90 series Volvos. We have a little Swedish flag right there on the side. The center of the seat bottom and back cushions are perforated, although this particular model does not have seat ventilation. These are heated, and you can see the extending thigh cushion section. This entire front section of the seat moves forward. Moving over to the front door panels, we have a lot of soft touch materials and a lot of stitch materials on the upper section of the door. There's a soft touch armrest right there. Since we're driving the R design trim, we have aluminum trim right there in the middle of the door, and then stitched goods right there up top. This model has the available Bowers & Wilkins sound system, which has been improved for 2021, we're told. And another change for 2021 is that we get a new air cleaning system in the cabin that removes smaller particles and has some particle sensors to help purify the air. Moving over to the dashboard, we have a stitched leather dashboard in this model with some additional aluminum trim right there, and then some faux aluminum trim below. Not every trim that you find in modern cars is real for a bunch of different practical reasons. This is aluminum up here, but down here we have imitation metal. The glove compartment is a large bin-style compartment. I was definitely able to fit large tablet computers inside. The interior design is essentially identical to the S90 sedan. You can see that we have that Bowers & Wilkins center channel speaker right there, and then we have the same infotainment screen that we find in the rest of the Volvo lineup. That is until we get the XC40 Recharge in America, which is going to be getting a new Google-based infotainment system that we also see in the Polestar 2. So expect that change coming up at some point in other Volvo models, but we don't see it in here for 2021. However, we do have a faster processor than the last few times that we've used this system. So if you've used any modern Volvo before and you thought that the system was a little bit too laggy, then you should keep in mind that Volvo has given this a much faster processor, so responses are definitely a lot snappier. Whether we're hitting these climate controls there, I have dry fingers, so it doesn't always sense my touch, but once it senses the touch, it definitely is speedy. Swiping things right there, that sort of thing, it's definitely faster than it was before. One thing I am surprised by, however, is that Volvo has not updated their software to allow Apple CarPlay to use a bit more of the screen real estate like we do find in the portrait orientation screens in the Subaru lineup. So if you thought that this was an Apple limitation for this particular screen format, it's not. It's actually a Volvo limitation. In modern Subaru models, they let you use much more of the screen in more of a portrait orientation mode. Below that, we have some of the physical controls for the system. Hazard lights right there, some buttons for the climate control system, track forward, backward, and a volume control knob. This is just a button blank. It doesn't do anything in the V90. And then we find a redesigned center console. We still have a traditional shifter right here, manual mode over to the left, right like that. But instead of a juice box holder there, we have a Qi wireless charging mat, 12-volt power port right up there. I have to say, since we don't have Apple CarPlay that's wireless, I think that I would rather have had that additional little cup holder. Let me know what you think about that in the comment section. We do have two very large cup holders right there. The engine start-stop toggle, the drive mode selector button and roller. It rolls around there and clicks. Electric parking brake, electric brake hold right there, and then a moderately sized sensor storage compartment. Remember, we do have 4-zone climate control, so some additional plumbing going on here. You could definitely keep some of those larger smartphones inside, however. This display is not quite as configurable, and I would say not quite as snazzy as some of the displays that we find in modern Mercedes models, but it is adjustable in terms of its looks, and you can use the on-screen interface to select your media source, interact with your phone, or navigation destinations as well. There's also a heads-up display available. The steering wheel remains the same as before. It's a 3-spoke variety with a split bottom spoke and sport grips up top. I had hoped that paddle shifters would make their way from other Volvo products down here into the V90, but we don't find that for 2021. On the left side, we have the controls for the radar adaptive cruise control system. On the right side of the steering wheel, we find volume up, down, track forward, backward, and then this also functions as the joystick control for the heads-up display or the multifunction LCD instrument cluster, depending on exactly where you are in the system. We have a voice command button right over there, and then the controls for the adaptive cruise control on the left. Out on the road, you'll certainly notice the performance difference between this and the XC60. This feels peppier. It also feels better connected to the driver and the road. 0 to 60 happened in this model in 5.5 seconds. This is the T6 all-wheel drive version again. That does make this, however, the slowest entry in this miniature-sized European wagon segment. This is about 0.8 of a second slower than the Mercedes-Benz E450 and about 0.3 of a second slower than the current generation Audi Allroad. Now, we don't have any 0 to 60 specifications for the new 2021 Mercedes-Benz all-terrain version of the E-Class wagon, but I suspect it's still going to be faster than any version of this in the United States. For some reason, Volvo does not send Americans any variant of their plug-in hybrid system, so you cannot get the V90 with the 400 horsepower plug-in hybrid that you can in the S90. Ever since the V90 launched in the United States, I had been hoping that they would bring that T8 plug-in hybrid system to this model. Now they've called that particular hybrid system the Recharge hybrid system. Whatever you want to call it, it's an excellent hybrid, it's an awful lot of power, and it would be certainly a lot of fun in the V90 wagon. We just don't get it, however. In my 60 to 0 braking tests, it took 109 feet for this model to stop from 60 miles an hour back to 0. So again, a little bit better than something like the Volvo XC60, and also a little better than the comparably equipped German options. This weighs a little bit less than the E450 or the Audi A6, about 4,250 pounds here. It's about 200 pounds lighter than the Germans. And you'll certainly notice the weight difference, especially versus something like the Audi A6 Allroad, which has a weight balance that's very similar to the Volvo, and actually a little bit less advantageous depending on exactly the version that you're looking at. Volvo has really done a lot of work to improve the handling abilities of their cars, even though they are based around a transverse engine and drivetrain layout up front, and there is certainly more weight on the front axle than on the rear axle. They've given us a double wishbone suspension like we find in the European competition, generally speaking. And they've also managed to shift more of the weight to the rear with every successive generation. So this doesn't feel front heavy like you can find in, say, a front wheel drive Acura TLX. Rather unfortunately, I don't have front to rear weight distribution figures on the new Allroad or this V90. However, I suspect that this is probably going to be a little bit lighter on the front axle than the Allroad. We see something very similar in the XC90 versus Audi Q7, and I wouldn't be surprised if it applied to this model as well. When it comes to handling, I'm certainly going to give this an A. This is not going to be as fun as something like the Mercedes-Benz E450. Depending on the road surface that you're on, we get more power out of that E450. It certainly has a stronger rear-wheel drive dynamic, but it's also going to be a little bit heavier, and you will feel that this is a little bit more nimble in some of those really tight corners. I think the Volvo has also done an excellent job when it comes to the balance of the suspension, balancing a good ride and decent handling as well. Now, we do have the adaptive suspension system, so I can put this in its Polestar engineered mode, which will change the throttle mapping. It will also adjust the dampers to make them a little bit firmer, but bear in mind that there is no drive mode that will make this suspension as firm as what we find in Mercedes-Benz AMG wagons. The model that I'm driving today has the optional 4C adaptive air suspension, but the important distinction between this vehicle's adaptive air suspension and the related system that we find in Volvo's XC90, their larger 3-row crossover, is that we do not have front air springs in the V90. This has only air springs in the back, so it's a load leveling rear air suspension rather than an adaptive height air suspension like we do find in something along the lines of the Audi Allroad or, of course, the Volvo XC90. This is the same suspension setup that we find in the cross-country variant of the V90. It uses an adaptive traditional damper up front, so it can change the characteristics of the suspension, becoming firmer or softer depending on your preferences, but it's never going to be able to adjust the height of the front portion of the suspension. This suspension design is very similar to what we found in the Jaguar XJ that was just discontinued, where it had an adaptive suspension up front and an adaptive height suspension in the rear. If you are planning on taking your cross-country a little further off the beaten path, keep in mind the rear air suspension is not going to improve ground clearance. It's simply going to improve the ride and give you the load leveling functionality that some people might be looking for. In my cabin noise testing at 50 miles an hour, I got 72 decibels in here, which puts this a little bit louder than the average mid-size luxury sedan. Generally speaking, Volvos tend to be a little bit louder out on the road than some of their German counterparts, and although I haven't tested the direct competition for this for 2021, I wouldn't be surprised if that continued. And that's why I'm going to give this a B when it comes to cabin noise. As we see in any wagon or SUV, you are going to get a little bit more road noise from the rear of the vehicle because that hatch is open to the passenger compartment, and in a sedan, the rear suspension would mainly be enclosed in the trunk as far as the noise transmission from some of those components goes. I've been averaging 26.9 miles per gallon over a week of mixed driving. In real-world driving, that puts this model closer to the front-wheel drive's EPA score of 27 miles per gallon. This particular model was EPA rated for 25, and we're certainly beating that handily. I'm going to give this an A+ because at the moment in this particular tiny segment, there is no hybrid or plug-in hybrid option. Again, I really wish that Volvo would bring us one because that hybrid system in vehicles like the S90 or the S60 give us absolutely excellent fuel economy and really impressive performance as well, very similar to mid-level AMG models in terms of 0 to 60 performance, but we just don't have one at the moment in the V90. Bottom lining, the V90 out on the road I think is pretty easy. This is the kind of wagon that's just incredibly easy to live with. The performance is excellent, the handling is excellent, the fuel economy is reasonable, and although you will get 0 to 60 faster in something like the Allroad or the Mercedes, they'll cost you a bit more. If you've made it this far in the video, you probably really want a wagon, so let's dive into the nuts and bolts of the pricing here. The V90 for 2021 will start at $52,445. If you want the cross country, that'll set you back a little bit more, $55,545. The V90 Cross Country is an interesting option here because it has 8.3 inches of ground clearance, which is considerably more than most of the competition. It really is up there with something like a Subaru Outback. And I suppose that's a way you could look at the V90, the Mercedes option, the Audi option, etc., is as the luxury alternative to that Subaru Outback. With the success of the Subaru Outback, I have to admit that I'm perplexed that the V90 Cross Country, the Mercedes-Benz All-Terrain, and the Audi Allroad don't sell better than they do, because the Outback is still very plainly a station wagon, and they sell nearly 200,000 of those a year, but we don't see that same sales success in the luxury segment for even off-road station wagons. Because Volvo doesn't sell very many wagons in the US, but they have 4 options to choose from, we need to talk about the engine lineup because it is a little bit funky. The V60 is about $10,000 less than the V90. We clearly get a few fewer features in there, but the big difference is that it's a scaled version. The V60 is available with the T5 250 horsepower engine and front-wheel drive, or from there you take a drastic leap up to the Polestar engineered plug-in hybrid system that gives you 415 horsepower and of course some electric range. For some reason in the V60 there is no 316 horsepower middle range like we find in the other Volvos out there. This is mainly because of the volume that Volvo is selling in wagons. A wider variety of engine options are available in Europe, but in the United States, the V60, V60 Cross Country, V90, and V90 Cross Country have relatively limited engine options. If you get the V60 Cross Country, then you'd get T5 all-wheel drive, only 250 horsepower. That's the only option that you get there. Quite logically, the V90 Cross Country and the V60 Cross Country do not get the plug-in hybrid system in the US because of the more off-road emission for these particular models. And even though we do get the e-all-wheel drive setup with that plug-in hybrid system, it's not going to be as off-road capable as a mechanical all-wheel drive system. With the V90 at this point in time, we get the T5 front-wheel drive engine or T6 316 horsepower for the all-wheel drive model. If you get the V90 Cross Country, it's available only in 316 horsepower all-wheel drive format. When it comes to competition, there really isn't very much. We have just 2 competitors at the moment in the United States because BMW has really chosen to abandon wagons in North America. And arguably, Mercedes is not giving it the best try either. We have the Mercedes-Benz E450 available in the US, but it's available only in the all-terrain format. So there's technically no direct corollary to the V60, the V60 Cross Country, or the regular V90 that I was driving this week, just the V90 Cross Country. Now, thankfully, that E450 does get one of Mercedes' newest engines, their inline-6 with their mild hybrid system, giving us 362 horsepower and a faster 0 to 60 time than everything in the Volvo lineup except for the plug-in hybrid. On the downside, the Mercedes is going to be exquisitely expensive. It's going to be at least $12,000 more than the V90 Cross Country, which is already more expensive than the regular V90. And of course, as we see in a lot of other Mercedes models, options get pretty expensive. So if you load your E450 completely up, it's going to be significantly more expensive than the V90. Some of that price difference is justified because we get a few more features on the E450 than we find in the V90 at the moment. It's going to be quicker 0 to 60, and I really love the 2-screen infotainment and digital instrument cluster setup that we find in modern Mercedes models, but it is going to be fantastically expensive if you get carried away with the options. The only other alternative in the US right now is the Audi Allroad, and I think this is truly the toughest competitor at the moment. What's interesting about the Allroad is that in this generation, Audi is really trying to muddy the ground between the regular wagon and the off-road wagon. It definitely has SUV-like cladding. I think it looks a little bit more SUV-ish than the V90 Cross Country or the Mercedes-Benz All-Terrain. But it's not actually that high off the ground. It has a full 4-corner air suspension that gives it adaptive height capability, much like we see in the Volvo XC90 and some other luxury SUVs out there. But even in its highest height mode, it's going to be an inch closer to the ground than the V90 Cross Country. And if you're thinking about taking your all-road a little bit further off the beaten path, it is important to keep in mind how adaptive air suspensions work. Essentially what's going on is we have a suspension control arm right like this. There's a wheel out here somewhere, and the air suspension basically pushes this down, so that way we have the wheel further away from the body. It increases that, but that means that the wheel is now at the bottom end of its suspension travel. So if you are planning on taking your all-road further off the beaten path and you are in that highest height mode, the ride quality gets really, really rough. We see that in any vehicle out there with an adaptive air suspension, whether we're talking about something like a Jeep Grand Cherokee or a Land Rover or Range Rover or a pickup truck, etc. But on the other hand, we do get a standard turbocharged V6 engine producing 335 horsepower, a standard dual-clutch automatic transmission, which is definitely slick shifting and will get you faster, about a second faster 0 to 60. Maintenance obviously is the downside to the Audi DCT. They do require more regular fluid changes than we find in the automatic transmissions in the rest of this segment, and some people may not like the way DCTs feel, but the Audi Allroad really is an intriguing option in this segment. I think it has a really, really gorgeous interior as well. I think I like the styling of the V90's interior a little bit better than the A6 Allroad, but I love the Allroad's gadgets more than the Volvo gadgets, and the Audi interior is exquisite in its own right. The styling is just a little bit different, not quite to my preference, but I think I could certainly live with that for the gorgeous LCD instrument cluster that we find in modern Audis with the Google satellite imagery, and it has the latest version of Audi's infotainment system in the dashboard as well. If you're looking for a wagon with a more traditional ride height, that's going to be the V90. If you're looking for a wagon with an extreme ride height, that's going to be the V90 Cross Country, and the Audi Allroad slots somewhere between these two realities. Now keep in mind that if you are planning on using that adaptive height suspension, and you really do need about 7 to 8 inches of ground clearance, and you want to drive a little bit faster, the V90 is certainly going to be more comfortable out on most of those rougher roads. If my own money were on the line, I'm pretty cheap, and I have owned Volvo wagons before, so keep that in mind, but I would probably end up with the Volvo wagon because it's about $10,000 less than the Audi Allroad. But I would probably be giving that Audi Allroad a really long look every time I passed by one on the road because it's gorgeous inside and outside. I love the feature set that we find on the Allroad. I love the fact that we get that adaptive four-corner air suspension. I really wish Volvo had spent more time on the V90 or V90 Cross Country to give them that adaptive suspension system out of the XC90. Apparently it wouldn't fit based on the style and the particular design of that architecture from the XC90. It just wouldn't fit under the hood in the S90 and V90 platform, but I really wish they had spent a little bit more time or tried to adapt something that would fit there a little bit better, because that is a really great feature in the Audi Allroad. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below, and do you think that the Audi Allroad is worth $10,000 more than the Volvo? I think it's definitely worth more than the Volvo. I'm just not sure if it's quite $10,000 more than the Volvo. Maybe about $5,000 to $6,000, and I would jump ship and get the Audi Allroad. Let me know what you think about that. And of course, be sure and go over to AOAmerch.com to check out the latest AOA merch. You can get a shirt right like this one here. There are also some additional designs, and there will be even more designs between now and Christmas of 2020. I'll see all of you later.